The truth George Strait hid for decades. When the king of country finally broke his silence, Michael Reynolds pressed his face against the rain-streaked window of the Greyhound bus as it rumbled through the Texas countryside, his worn leather messenger bag clutched tightly in his lap. Inside that bag lay his entire future, a digital recorder that had seen better days, a notebook filled with questions no one had ever dared to ask George Strait, and a letter from Rolling Stone that could either make or destroy his career. The letter was brief, almost cruel in its simplicity. One shot, Reynolds, the interview everyone wants but no one gets. Fail, and don't it bother reapplying. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, 32 years old, chasing the most elusive figure in country music, while his own life crumbled around him like autumn leaves. 3 months had passed since the phone call that shattered everything, the call that told him his younger brother Danny had been found in his apartment, another casualty of the opioid crisis that was silently devouring small-town America. Danny, who used to sneak into Michael E.'s room at night when thunderstorms scared him, who learned to play guitar by watching YouTube videos, who had dreams of Nashville that never made it past the city limits. Michael E.'s editor at the Music Chronicle, a small but respected online publication, had suggested the George Strait assignment as a way to get back in the game. What she didn't understand was that Michael wasn't sure he wanted to be in any game anymore. Grief had a way of making everything else seem pointless, like trying to write about music when the silence in his own head was deafening. But there was something about George Strait that drew him in, something beyond the 60 number-one hits and the sold-out stadiums. Maybe it was the way the king of country had always kept his personal life locked away. Or maybe it was the rumors that whispered through Nashville about a tragedy that had shaped the man behind the legend. The bus pulled into the station in San Antonio, and Michael gathered his things with the mechanical precision of someone who had been traveling light for years. As he stepped onto the platform, the Texas heat hit him like a wall, thick and oppressive, even in the early morning hours. He had 12 hours before the benefit concert at the Alamodome, 12 hours to somehow figure out how to get past the layers of security and handlers that surrounded George Strait like medieval armor. Other journalists had tried for decades and failed, their requests met with polite but firm rejections from Straight's team. But Michael had something they didn't IT. Desperation born from loss, and a story that might just resonate with a man who understood what it meant to guard his pain like a sacred flame. He had written about Danny's death just once, a raw and honest piece that his editor had almost refused to publish because it was too personal, too unfiltered. It was the first time Michael had ever written from the heart instead of the head, and the response from readers had been overwhelming. Letters poured in from people sharing their own stories of loss, their own struggles with grief, their own attempts to find meaning in the meaningless. Now, as he walked through the crowded streets of San Antonio toward his hotel, Michael wondered if that vulnerability might be his key. George Strait had lost his daughter Jennifer in a car accident back in 1986 when she was just 13 years old. It was public knowledge. But Strait had never spoken about it in detail, never allowed it to become part of his public narrative. What if Michael could approach it differently? What if instead of trying to exploit the tragedy, he could offer understanding from someone who walked the same dark path? The hotel was nothing fancy, a budget chain that smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and broken dreams. Michael A.'s room overlooked a parking lot where the asphalt shimmered with heat waves, distorting everything until it looked like a mirage. He sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out his notebook, reading through the questions he had prepared. Most of them suddenly seemed inadequate, the kind of generic inquiries that any journalist might ask. He needed something different, something that would cut through the professional distance that Strait maintained like a protective shield. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister Sarah, back in Ohio. "Thinking of you today. Danny would be proud." Michael stared at the message until the letters blurred together. Would Danny be proud? Or would he think his older brother was chasing ghosts, trying to make sense of senseless loss by intruding on someone else's carefully guarded grief? The line between journalism and exploitation could be razor thin, and Michael had seen too many reporters cross it in pursuit of a story that would make their careers. The Alamodome loomed in the distance as Michael made his way across downtown San Antonio that evening, press credentials hanging around his neck like a talisman. The benefit concert was for the children, CES Hospital of San Antonio, one of the few causes that could draw George Strait out of his carefully orchestrated retirement from touring. The King of Country had always been selective about his appearances, but when children were involved, his team somehow found room in his schedule. Backstage was controlled chaos, a maze of equipment cases and bustling crew members preparing for what would be one of the biggest country music events of the year. Michael flashed his credentials and followed the stream of people toward the media area, his heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. Somewhere in this labyrinth of cables and curtains was George Strait, the man who had been dodging personal questions for 4 decades, the artist who had sold over 100 million records while revealing almost nothing about the person behind the music. The first sign of trouble came in the form of Wade Thompson, Strait's manager and gatekeeper, a man whose reputation for protecting his client was legendary throughout the music industry. Thompson was in his 60s, with silver hair slicked back and a suit that probably cost more than Michael's monthly rent. He was surrounded by a cluster of established music journalists, men and women whose bylines appeared in major publications, whose questions would be answered with the same polite but distant responses that Strait had perfected over the years. Michael hung back, observing the dynamics, trying to find an opening. He watched as Thompson dismissed one reporter after another with practiced efficiency, his smile never wavering, but his eyes remaining cold and calculating. When the group began to disperse, Michael saw his chance and approached cautiously, his press credentials held out like a peace offering. "Excuse me, Mr. Thompson. Michael Reynolds from the Music Chronicle. I was hoping to request a brief interview with Mr. Strait after the show." His voice sounded steadier than he felt, and he was grateful for that small mercy. Thompson's eyes swept over Michael with the kind of dismissive assessment that comes from decades of dealing with hopeful journalists. "The Music Chronicle," he repeated slowly, as if tasting something unpleasant. "Never heard of it. Online publication." There was disdain in his voice, the kind reserved for digital media outlets that traditional gatekeepers considered beneath their notice. "Yes, sir, but we have a substantial readership and—" Michael began, but Thompson cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Kid, let me save you some time. George Strait doesn't do personal interviews. Hasn't he in years, especially not with—" He gestured vaguely at Michael's rumpled shirt and worn shoes, "publications I've never heard of. Why don't you stick to the press conference questions like everyone else?" The dismissal stung, but Michael pressed on. "I understand his position, but I have a different approach. I recently lost my brother, and I wrote about grief in a way that might resonate with Mr. Strait's experience. I'm not looking to sensationalize anything, just to offer a platform for honest conversation about loss and healing." Thompson's expression hardened, and his voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "Listen carefully, son. If you think you can manipulate your way into George's good graces by playing the dead brother card, you're not just naive, you're disgusting. Grief isn't a journalistic tool, and anyone who thinks it is has no business calling themselves a reporter." The words hit Michael like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. Around them, other members of the media were beginning to take notice, and Michael felt the familiar heat of humiliation creeping up his neck. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that his intentions were genuine, but the words stuck in his throat like sawdust. "Furthermore," Thompson continued, his voice rising slightly, "if I see you anywhere near Mr. Strait tonight, If you so much as look in his direction during the show, I'll have security remove you from the building and make sure your credentials are revoked permanently. Are we clear?" Michael nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. He backed away from Thompson and the curious stares of the other journalists, his face burning with shame and anger. The worst part was that he couldn't entirely dismiss the manager's words. Was he exploiting his own grief? Was he using Danny's death as a key to unlock doors that should remain closed? The questions followed him as he retreated to a quiet corner of the backstage area where he could collect himself before the show began. As he stood there, trying to process what had just happened, Michael overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. Clayton Reed, a documentary filmmaker known for his sensationalized exposés on celebrities, was speaking with someone on his phone in what he probably thought was a private conversation. "The George Strait project is moving forward," Reed was saying, his voice carrying the excitement of someone who smelled money in the water. "We got our hands on some incredible material, home recordings of him and his daughter Jennifer from before she died. Never been heard before. Incredibly intimate stuff. The family doesn't know we have them yet, but once this documentary drops, it's going to change everything people think they know about the King of Country." Michael's stomach lurched as the full implications hit him. This wasn't just about his failed attempt at an interview anymore. This was about a man's most sacred memories being violated for profit, about a father's private grief being turned into entertainment. He thought about Danny, about how he would feel if someone had secret recordings of their last conversations and planned to broadcast them to the world without his permission. The rage that followed was unlike anything he had ever experienced, a white-hot fury that made his hands shake and his vision blur at the edges. Reed continued his conversation, oblivious to the storm he had unleashed in the young journalist's heart. "We are talking about a streaming deal worth millions. Everyone wants to know what George Strait is really like, what broke him, why he became such a recluse. These recordings will give them that glimpse behind the curtain they've been craving for decades." Without fully realizing what he was doing, Michael stepped forward, his press credentials swaying with the sudden movement. "Excuse me," he said, his voice louder than he intended. Reed looked up, annoyed at the interruption, and Michael could see the calculation in the filmmaker's eyes as he assessed this new threat to his conversation. "What do you want, kid? Cannot you see I am on the phone?" Reed's tone was dismissive, but there was something else there, too. A wariness that suggested he knew he had been overheard discussing something he probably shouldn't have been talking about in such a public space. "I couldn't help but overhear about your George Strait documentary," Michael said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the anger coursing through his system. "Those recordings you mentioned, the ones with his daughter, do you have permission from the family to use them?" Reed's expression shifted from annoyed to openly hostile. "That yes, none of your business, and frankly, it's not how journalism works. When material becomes available, real documentarians use it. We're not making a puff piece here. We're retelling the truth about an icon who has hidden behind his music for too long." "The truth?" Michael G's voice cracked slightly, and he hated himself for showing weakness in front of this predator. Or exploitation. There's a difference between journalism and grave robbing, and what you were describing sounds a lot more like the latter. The confrontation was drawing attention now, and Michael could see other members of the media beginning to drift toward them, sensing a story in the making. Reed seemed to realize this too, because he ended his phone call abruptly and stepped closer to Michael, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "Listen carefully, amateur. I've been making documentaries since before you were born. I know what constitutes fair use, and I know how to protect my sources. If you think you can intimidate me with some misguided sense of journalistic ethics, you're even more naive than you look." Before Michael could respond, the lights in the backstage area dimmed, and the familiar sound of a country band warming up drifted through the walls. The show was about to begin, and with it, Michael's last chance to salvage something from this disaster of an evening. He backed away from Reed, his mind racing with possibilities and doubts in equal measure. The Alamodome was packed to capacity. 25,000 fans who had paid premium prices to see the King of Country perform for charity. Michael found his way to the media section, a cluster of folding chairs set up to one side of the stage where photographers and reporters could document the show without interfering with the audience experience. The other journalists nodded politely but kept their distance, word of his confrontation with Wade Thompson having spread through the small community of music writers like wildfire. When George Strait walked onto the stage, the roar from the crowd was deafening. Even from his position in the media section, Michael could feel the energy radiating from 25,000 people who were witnessing something special. Strait looked exactly as Michael had expected, tall and lean in his signature Wrangler jeans and cowboy hat, moving with the easy confidence of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times before. But as the King of Country began his set with "Check yes or no," Michael found himself studying the man's face instead of just listening to the music. There was something in Straight's eyes, a sadness that the stage lights couldn't quite hide, a weight that seemed to press down on his shoulders even as he smiled and waved at the adoring crowd. This was a man carrying invisible burdens, and Michael began to understand why he had built such high walls around his personal life. The set list was a journey through 4 decades of country music history, each song a milestone in a career that had redefined the genre. When Strait performed "Carrying Your Love with Me," Michael noticed how the singer's gaze drifted to a specific section of the arena, as if he were singing to someone who wasn't there. The moment lasted only seconds, but it was enough to confirm what Michael had suspected. George Strait's music was an just entertainment. It was therapy, a way of processing emotions too complex for ordinary conversation. During All My Exes Live in Texas, the crowd sang along with such enthusiasm that Strait actually laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his entire face and reminded Michael that beneath the legend was a human being who still found joy in simple moments. It was the first time all evening that Michael felt something other than anger and frustration, a brief glimpse of the connection between artist and audience that made live music magical. But the moment that changed everything came during the encore. Strait had just finished Amarillo Morning when he did something unprecedented in Michael's experience. He broke from his usual routine and addressed the audience directly, not about the music or the charity, but about something deeper. "You know," Strait said, his voice carrying easily through the arena's sound system, "people always ask me why I don't do many interviews, why I keep my personal life private. The truth is, some things are too precious to share with strangers. Some memories are too sacred to turn into sound bites." The arena fell silent, 25,000 people hanging on every word from a man who rarely spoke so candidly in public. Michael felt his pulse quicken as he realized he was witnessing something extraordinary, a crack in the armor that Strait had worn for decades. "But lately I've been thinking about legacy," Strait continued, adjusting his hat in a gesture that somehow made him seem more vulnerable despite his commanding presence on stage. "About what we leave behind and how we choose to remember the people we love. There are some folks out there who think they can tell my story without my permission, use private moments for public consumption. Well, I want you all to know that when I'm ready to share those memories, I'll do it my way, with people I trust, on my own terms." The applause that followed was different from the usual concert cheering, deeper somehow, more respectful. Michael realized that Strait wasn't just talking to his fans, he was sending a message to people like Clayton Reed, drawing a line in the sand about what was and wasn't acceptable when it came to his family's privacy. As the show ended and the crowd began to file out, Michael remained in his seat, his mind spinning with the implications of what he had just witnessed. George Strait knew about the unauthorized documentary, which meant he was already preparing to fight back. The question was how, and whether Michael might somehow find himself on the right side of that battle. The backstage area was controlled chaos as crew members began the massive job of breaking down the show's equipment. Michael wandered through the maze of cables and road cases, unsure of what he was looking for, but unwilling to leave without trying one more time. His confrontation with Wade Thompson had been humiliating, but it had also revealed something important. Straight's team was genuinely protective of him, not just as a client, but as a person they cared about. He was considering how to approach Thompson again, maybe with an apology and a different angle, when he heard his name being called. Turning, he was shocked to see a woman in her 50s approaching, someone he didn't recognize, but who clearly knew who he was. "Mr. Reynolds? I am Janet Morrison, Mr. Straight's personal assistant. He'd like to speak with you privately if you have a moment." Michael's heart stopped. After everything that had happened, after Wade Thompson's public dismissal and his own bungled attempt at networking, George Strait wanted to see him. It seemed impossible, but Janet's expression was serious and businesslike, suggesting this wasn't just some kind of joke or mistake. "He knows who I am?" Michael managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Janet smiled, the first genuinely warm expression he had encountered all evening. "Oh yes, Mr. Reynolds. He knows exactly who you are, and more importantly, he knows about your article on grief and loss. You wrote about your brother Daniel, didn't you? The piece that was published 3 months ago in the Music Chronicle?" Michael nodded, too stunned to speak. Somehow, impossibly, the king of country music had not only heard of his small online publication, but had actually read his most personal work. "He'd like to meet you at his hotel in an hour," Janet continued, handing him a business card with an address. "Suite 1201. Come alone and Mr. Reynolds." She paused, her expression becoming more serious. "What you overheard about the documentary tonight, Mr. Strait, is aware of that situation. He has some questions for you about journalism and integrity, and what it means to tell someone a story with respect rather than exploitation." As Janet disappeared back into the crowd, Michael stared at the card in his trembling hands. In one impossible evening, he had gone from humiliation to hope, from failure to the opportunity of a lifetime. But as he made his way toward the exit, he couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting wasn't just about an interview. George Strait had heard about Clayton Reed's plans, and somehow Michael had become a player in a much larger game than he had ever imagined. The hotel where Strait was staying was one of San Antonio's finest, a towering monument of glass and steel that seemed to pierce the Texas sky. Michael arrived exactly an hour after his encounter with Janet, his shirt freshly pressed and his notebook tucked safely in his messenger bag. The lobby was all marble and crystal, the kind of place where every footstep echoed with the weight of money and influence. He approached the front desk with his press credentials visible, though he doubted they would be necessary given Janet's specific instructions. "Suite 1201, he told the concierge, who nodded knowingly and directed him toward a private elevator that required a special key card. As the elevator climbed toward the penthouse level, Michael tried to prepare himself for what was about to happen. In all his years of journalism, he had never interviewed anyone of George Strait's caliber, never sat across from someone whose voice had provided the soundtrack to millions of American lives. The elevator doors opened to reveal a hallway with only 2 suites, and Janet Morrison was waiting for him outside the door marked 1201. She looked him up and down approvingly, as if his efforts to clean himself up had met with her satisfaction. "He's waiting for you in the sitting room," she said, opening the door with another key card. "Mr. Reynolds, I want you to understand something before you go in there. George Strait is many things, but above all, he is a father who has carried an unbearable weight for 38 years. If you are here to exploit that pain in any way, it would be better for everyone if you left right now." Michael met her gaze steadily, thinking of Danny and the promise he had made at his brother's funeral to honor his memory by living with integrity. I lost my brother 3 months ago to an overdose. The last thing I would ever do is exploit someone else's grief for professional gain. If Mr. Strait is willing to share his story, I want to tell it the way it deserves to be told, with respect and dignity." Janet studied his face for a long moment, then nodded and stepped aside. "He's through those doors. Take your time, and remember that this conversation is entirely off the record unless he specifically tells you otherwise." The sitting room was surprisingly modest for such an expensive suite, furnished with comfortable chairs and a view of the San Antonio skyline that sparkled like scattered diamonds in the darkness. George Strait was standing by the window when Michael entered, still wearing his stage clothes, but with his cowboy hat set aside on a nearby table. Without the hat, he looked older, more vulnerable, the lines around his eyes more pronounced in the soft lamplight. "Mr. Reynolds," Strait said, turning to face him. "Thank you for coming. Please have a seat." Michael settled into one of the chairs, his hands clasped tightly in his lap to keep them from shaking. Being in the same room as George Strait felt surreal, like stepping into a dream that he wasn't sure he belonged in. "I read your article about Danny," Strait said without preamble, taking the chair across from Michael. "Your brother. Janet found it online after we heard what Wade did to you backstage. I want you to know that his behavior doesn't represent how I feel about journalists who approach difficult subjects with honesty and respect. The use of Danny A.'s name, spoken with such genuine care by someone who had never met him, brought unexpected tears to Michael S. eyes. He blinked them back, not wanting to appear unprofessional, but Strait had already noticed. "It is all right," the singer said gently. Grief isn't something you can schedule around interviews or professional obligations. Trust me, I know." "Mr. Strait," Michael began, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I want you to know that I would never use my loss, or yours, as some kind of manipulation tactic. When I wrote about Danny, it was because people needed to understand that addiction doesn't discriminate, that it can take anyone from any family. But I also wrote it because keeping the pain locked inside was killing me slowly." Strait nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Tell me about him. Not for any article or interview, just because sometimes it helps to talk about the people we've lost with someone who understands." For the next 30 minutes, Michael found himself sharing memories of Danny that he had never told anyone, not even his sister Sarah. He talked about how Danny used to practice guitar in the garage until their neighbors complained, how he had dreams of writing songs that would make people feel less alone, how he had struggled with prescription painkillers after a construction accident before the addiction spiraled beyond anyone's ability to control it. Strait listened without interruption, occasionally asking gentle questions that showed he understood the complex emotions surrounding the loss of someone to addiction, the guilt and anger and helplessness that came with watching a loved one destroy themselves, despite everyone in his best efforts to save them. "The hardest part," Michael said, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, "is knowing that his last thoughts were probably of how much pain he was in, not just physical, but emotional. He left a note apologizing for being a burden, for not being strong enough. He thought he was protecting us by leaving. Jennifer left me a note too," Strait said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not a suicide note, nothing like that. Just a little thing she wrote before she went out that night, telling me she loved me and that she was proud to be my daughter. I found it on her dresser after the accident. She had drawn little hearts around the edges. The silence that followed was heavy with shared understanding. Two men who had been forever changed by loss, sitting in a luxury hotel suite and finding comfort in their mutual pain. Michael realized that this wasn't an interview anymore. It was something much more precious and rare, a genuine human connection forged in the crucible of grief. "Mr. Strait," Michael said finally, "I overheard Clayton Reed tonight talking about some recordings of you and Jennifer. He said they were going to use them in his documentary without your permission." Strait's expression hardened, the vulnerability of moments before replaced by something colder and more determined. And I know about Clayton Reed and his documentary. He contacted my lawyers last week, claiming he had a right to use those recordings under fair use provisions. What he doesn't know is that those recordings were stolen from my home studio during a break-in 5 years ago. The police never found who did it, and I assumed the tapes were gone forever. Stolen? Michael felt a chill run down his spine. This was worse than he had imagined. Not just an unauthorized documentary, but one built on criminally obtained materials. My home studio, where Jennifer and I used to practice together, was broken into along with the main house. They took some equipment, some cash, but what hurt the most was losing those tapes. They were the last recordings I had of her voice, of us singing together. She was learning harmonies, wanted to surprise her mother with a song for her birthday. Strait stood and walked back to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. I've spent 5 years grieving those lost recordings on top of everything else. Now Clayton Reed wants to broadcast them to the world like some kind of sensationalized peek behind the curtain of my private pain. What are you going to do? Michael asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. I'm going to stop him, Strait said, turning back to face Michael. But I need help from someone who understands the difference between telling a story and exploiting a tragedy. Someone who knows what it means to honor the memory of someone you've lost instead of using them for profit. The implication hung in the air between them, and Michael felt his heart racing as he began to understand what Strait was suggesting. This wasn't just about an interview anymore. It was about something much bigger and more important. There's something else I need to tell you, Strait continued. Tomorrow morning I'm flying back to my ranch in Texas. It is where I go when the world gets too loud, where I keep Jennifer's memory alive in the way that feels right to me. I'd like you to come with me, if you were willing, not as a journalist hunting for a story, but as someone who might understand why that place means everything to me. Michael's mind raced with the implications of what Strait was offering. A private invitation to the ranch that the King of Country had kept hidden from the public for decades, a chance to see the place where George Strait was just a father dealing with loss rather than a musical icon performing for millions. Why me? Michael asked, genuinely puzzled. You don't know me, don't know if you can trust me with something so personal. Strait smiled, the first genuine smile Michael had seen from him all evening. Because you wrote about Danny with love instead of pity, with honesty instead of sensationalism. Because when Wade humiliated you tonight, you didn't try to sneak around or find another angle to exploit. And because when you overheard Reed talking about those recordings, your first instinct was to be disgusted by the violation rather than excited about the scoop. But what about your team? Your manager seemed pretty clear about his feelings toward me. Wade Thompson works for me, not the other way around, Strait said firmly. He is protective because he has seen too many people try to use my tragedy for their own gain. But he'll understand when I explain that you're different, that you're someone who might help me tell my story the right way before Reed can poison the well with his exploitation. As Michael sat there processing everything that had happened, he realized that this moment would define not just his career, but his entire understanding of what journalism could be at its best. He could write about George Strait, the icon, the king of country music with 60 #1 hits and a carefully guarded private life. Or he could write about George Strait, the man, the father who had built a sanctuary for his daughter's memory and was now fighting to protect it from those who would desecrate it for profit. Mr. Strait, Michael said, his voice steady with newfound purpose, I would be honored to visit your ranch and learn about the place that means so much to you. And if you decide you want to share that story publicly, I promise you that I'll tell it with the respect and dignity that Jennifer's memory deserves. Strait extended his hand, and when Michael shook it, he felt like he was making a promise, not just to the man across from him, but to Danny and Jennifer and everyone else who had ever been reduced to a sound bite or a sensational headline. We leave at 8 in the morning, Strait said. Pack light and bring your notebook. You're about to see the most important place in my world, the place where the real George Strait lives. And Mr. Reynolds?" He paused, his expression becoming serious again. "What you learn there will change everything you think you know about loss, memory, and what it really means to keep someone's spirit alive." As Michael left the hotel that night, his head spinning with the impossibility of what had just transpired, he couldn't help but think that Danny would be proud of him for choosing integrity over exploitation, for being trusted with someone else's sacred pain. Tomorrow, he would see the place where the king of country music had learned to live with unbearable loss, and somehow he suspected he would also learn something about how to carry Danny's memory forward with grace instead of bitterness. The flight to George Strait's ranch took place in a private jet that was surprisingly understated, more functional than luxurious. Michael had expected something flashier from one of country music's biggest stars, but as he watched Strait review papers and make quiet phone calls during the 90-minute flight, he began to understand that this was a man who valued substance over show, privacy over publicity. "We'll be landing on my private strip in about 10 minutes, Strait said, setting aside a folder marked with his lawyer's letterhead. "I want you to understand something before we arrive. What you're about to see, most people never get to experience. This ranch is not just where I live, it is where I heal, where I remember, where I've learned to carry Jennifer's spirit without letting the weight of losing her destroy everything else I love." And through the small airplane window, Michael could see the Texas landscape stretching endlessly in every direction, rolling hills dotted with oak trees and cattle, a vastness that seemed to swallow up human concerns and put them in perspective. As they descended toward a small landing strip carved into the countryside, he caught his first glimpse of the Strait Ranch, a collection of buildings that looked organic to the landscape, as if they had grown from the earth itself rather than being imposed upon it. The main house was larger than Michael had expected, but not ostentatiously so. A sprawling structure of native stone and weathered wood that blended seamlessly with the natural environment. What struck him most was how normal it looked, how lived in and comfortable, nothing like the sterile mansions he had imagined country music royalty might inhabit. "Home," Strait said simply as they climbed down from the plane. "Been building this place piece by piece for 25 years. Every fence post, every building, every tree I planted myself or supervised personally. When you've lost what I've lost, you learn not to trust other people with the things that matter most." They climbed into an old pickup truck that had clearly seen better days, its paint faded and its interior worn soft by years of use. As they drove the winding dirt road toward the house, Michael noticed details that spoke of a man who found peace in simple pleasures. A vegetable garden tended with obvious care, horses grazing in pastures bordered by hand-built stone walls, a workshop filled with woodworking tools where Strait apparently spent time crafting things with his own hands. "That's where it all began," Strait said, pointing to a small building set apart from the others. "My first recording studio, built in 1985. Jennifer was 12 then, just starting to show real interest in music. We spent hours in there together, her learning to harmonize while I worked on new songs. The studio looked exactly like what it was, a labor of love built by a father who wanted to share his passion with his daughter. It was modest but clearly functional, with windows that looked out over the pastures and a porch where chairs suggested long conversations about music and life. But it was the building next to the original studio that took Michael's breath away. Newer, but designed to complement the older structure, it was clearly a memorial of some kind, though Strait didn't immediately explain its purpose. "We'll visit that later," Strait said, noticing Michael's curiosity. "Right now, I want you to meet Norma, my wife of 51 years. She's the real strength of this family, the one who held everything together when losing Jennifer nearly broke me apart." Norma Strait was waiting on the porch of the main house, a woman in her 70s whose eyes held the same quiet strength that Michael had noticed in her husband. She greeted Michael with genuine warmth, as if hosting journalists at their private sanctuary was something she did regularly, though he suspected the opposite was true. "Welcome to our home," she said, shaking his hand firmly. "George told me about your brother and about why you breathe here. It takes courage to write about loss the way you did, to make yourself vulnerable in service of helping others understand that they are not alone in their grief." Over lunch on the porch, Michael began to understand the rhythm of life at the Strait ranch. This was a working cattle operation, not a gentleman-esque hobby farm, and both George and Norma were intimately involved in every aspect of its management. They spoke knowledgeably about feed prices and weather patterns, about which pastures needed rotation and which fences required repair. This was their real life, far from the spotlights and recording studios, and it was clear that they had found genuine contentment in its simplicity. "People always assume that fame and success insulate you from real problems," George said, cutting into the homemade cornbread that Norma had prepared. "But grief is the great equalizer. It does not care how many records you've sold or how many awards you've won. When you lose a child, you are just another broken parent trying to figure out how to keep breathing." After lunch, George led Michael on a walking tour of the property, sharing stories about different buildings and landmarks that clearly held deep meaning for him. There was the oak tree where Jennifer had built a treehouse, the pond where she learned to fish, the barn where her horse still lived in comfortable retirement. Each location was maintained with obvious care, not as a museum, but as a living testament to a life that had been cut tragically short. "The thing about grief," George said as they paused beside the pond where dragonflies skimmed across the surface, "is that it never really goes away. You just learn to carry it differently. At first, it is like a boulder on your chest, crushing everything else out of your life. But eventually, if you're lucky and you work at it, it becomes more like a stone in your pocket, something you're always aware of, but that does not prevent you from moving forward." As the afternoon wore on, Michael began to understand why Strait had brought him here. This wasn't tea about getting an interview or even about stopping Clayton Reed's documentary, though those things were important. This was about showing someone who understood loss that it was possible to honor the dead without being destroyed by their absence, to build something meaningful from the raw materials of grief and memory. Their peaceful afternoon was interrupted by the sound of a car approaching on the gravel drive. Straight's expression darkened as he recognized the vehicle, and Michael felt a chill of apprehension as he realized who their uninvited visitor was likely to be. Clayton Reed climbed out of a rented sedan, his expensive suit already wilting in the Texas heat. He was accompanied by a camera operator and what appeared to be a sound technician, clearly hoping to ambush Strait with an impromptu interview for his unauthorized documentary. "Mr. Strait," Reed called out, his voice carrying the false friendliness of someone who made his living from other people's pain. "And I was in the area and thought we might have a conversation about my upcoming documentary. I think you'll find that my portrayal of your daughter's memory is quite respectful." Straight's jaw tightened, but when he spoke, his voice was calm and controlled. "Mr. Reed, you were trespassing on private property. You have 30 seconds to get back in your car and leave, or I'll call the sheriff and have you arrested." "Oh, now," Reed said, signaling his camera operator to start rolling. "Surely we can discuss this like civilized adults. The American people have a right to know about the real George Strait, the man behind the carefully constructed public image. Your daughter Ness recordings are going to be part of that story, whether you cooperate or not." What happened next surprised Michael with its swiftness and decisiveness. Strait pulled out his cell phone and dialed a number he clearly had memorized. "Sheriff Martinez, George Strait. I have trespassers on my property attempting to film without permission. Yes, the main gate. They in violation of the restraining order my lawyers filed yesterday." He paused, listening, then smiled grimly. "Thank you, Jim. They'll be gone by the time you arrive." Reed's confidence visibly wavered as he realized that Strait had been preparing for this confrontation. Restraining order. You can stop the press from doing legitimate journalism. What you replanning isn't a journalism, it's grave robbing, Strait said, his voice rising for the first time since Michael had met him. Those recordings you claim to have were stolen from my home, which makes you a trafficker in stolen goods. But more than that, there are private moments between a father and daughter that were never meant for public consumption. Michael watched the confrontation unfold with a mixture of admiration and horror. Here was a man defending his daughter E's memory with the same fierce protectiveness he had probably shown when she was alive, and Reed's casual exploitation of that sacred bond was laid bare for what it truly was. Furthermore, Strait continued, stepping closer to Reed, I've decided to tell my own story, in my own words, with a journalist who understands the difference between honoring memory and exploiting tragedy. Mr. Reynolds here will be writing the authorized account of my life, including my relationship with Jennifer, and it will be published before your unauthorized documentary can poison the well with stolen materials and fabricated drama. Reed's eyes widened as he realized what Strait was announcing. An authorized biography would completely undermine the market for his exploitative documentary, especially one written by a journalist who had gained Strait's trust and cooperation. You can do this, Reed stammered, his composure finally cracking. I have contracts, investors, a streaming deal worth millions. Then you should have thought about that before you decided to build your project on stolen goods and violated privacy, Strait replied calmly. My lawyers will be in touch with your distributors about the criminal nature of your source material. Good day, Mr. Reed. The sound of sirens in the distance made Reed's decision for him. He and his crew scrambled back into their car and sped away down the gravel drive, leaving a cloud of dust that seemed symbolic of their shattered plans. As the sheriff's car arrived and Strait explained the situation to his longtime friend, Michael realized that he had just witnessed something extraordinary. Not just the confrontation with Reed, but the moment when George Strait had decided to take control of his own narrative after decades of guarding it in silence. So, Strait said as the sheriff departed and they walked back toward the house, it seems you've just become my official biographer. Think you re-up for the job? Michael's head was spinning with the implications of what had just occurred. The interview he had hoped for had transformed into something much bigger and more significant. A project that would not only define his career, but also serve as a weapon in the fight to protect Jennifer Strait's memory from those who would exploit it. Mr. Strait, he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what was being offered, I would be honored to help you tell your story the way it deserves to be told. But I have one condition. When we write about Jennifer, we do it as a celebration of her life, not as an exploitation of her death. Her memory deserves better than to be reduced to a tragic footnote in someone else's success story. Strait smiled, the first completely unguarded expression Michael had seen from him since their initial meeting. Mr. Reynolds, I think you are going to fit in just fine around here. Now come on. There is something else I need to show you, something that will help you understand why protecting Jennifer's legacy is worth fighting for. As they walked toward the memorial building Michael had noticed earlier, he realized that his journey from failed interview to authorized biographer was only the beginning. The real story, the one that would challenge everything he thought he knew about love, loss, and the power of memory, was waiting for him inside that carefully tended sanctuary where a father kept his daughter's spirit alive through music, devotion, and the kind of love that transcends death itself. The Jennifer Strait Memorial Studio was unlike anything Michael had ever seen. From the outside, it appeared to be a simple recording facility, but as Strait unlocked the heavy wooden door with a key he wore on a chain around his neck, Michael realized he was about to enter something far more sacred than any professional studio. The interior was bathed in soft, warm light that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. The walls were lined with photographs of Jennifer at every age, from baby pictures to the last photo taken just weeks before her death. But these weren't the sad, mournful images you might expect in a memorial. They were pictures of pure joy. Jennifer on horseback, Jennifer laughing with her friends, Jennifer sitting at the piano with her father, both of them grinning as they worked on a song together. She wanted to be a songwriter, Strait said, his voice filled with pride rather than sorrow. Not a performer, she was too shy for that. But she had this incredible gift for finding just the right words to express what people were feeling. Look at this. He led Michael to a display case containing handwritten lyrics in a young girl's careful script. The song was called Daddy S. Hands, and as Michael read the words, he felt tears spring to his eyes. It was a simple, beautiful tribute to a father's love, written with the kind of innocent wisdom that only children possess. She wrote that for Father's Day when she was 11, Strait continued. Said she wanted to capture what it felt like to feel completely safe and loved. We were working on the melody together when... His voice trailed off, but for the first time since Michael had known him, he didn't seem to be drowning in the pain of that memory. The centerpiece of the studio was a state-of-the-art recording setup, but one that had clearly been designed for comfort rather than commercial use. There were 2 microphones side by side, positioned at different heights, and Michael realized with a start that one had been set for a child's height and had never been moved. After she died, Strait said, settling into one of the comfortable chairs positioned near the recording equipment, I couldn't come in here for 2 years. Norma would find me sitting outside the door sometimes, just listening to the silence where her voice used to be. But then one day, I realized that avoiding this place was to honoring her memory, it was abandoning it. He moved to a cabinet filled with carefully labeled recordings and selected one with trembling hands. The label read, Jennifer and Daddy, October 1985, written in Jennifer Ick's own neat handwriting. She always insisted on labeling our practice sessions, Strait said with a smile that transformed his entire face. Said we needed to keep track of our progress like real songwriters do. This was our last recording together, made 3 weeks before the accident. She had finally mastered the harmony on All My Exes Live in Texas, and she was so proud. As Strait loaded the tape into the playback system, Michael felt like he was about to witness something holy, a moment that had been preserved in amber for 38 years. The first sound that filled the room was laughter, light and musical, and so full of life that it seemed impossible it could be coming from someone who had been gone for decades. Daddy, start over. I giggled right in the middle of the verse, came Jennifer's voice, clear and sweet and bursting with the kind of unself-conscious joy that only children know. That's what makes it perfect, sweetheart, came George's younger voice in response. Real music has real life in it, including the giggles. What followed was the most beautiful thing Michael had ever heard. Father and daughter singing together, their voices blending in perfect harmony. But more than that, their love for each other evident in every note, every shared breath, every moment of musical connection. Jennifer's voice was pure and true, but it was the obvious delight she took in singing with her father that made the recording transcendent. As the song ended, both men sat in silence, but it wasn't to the heavy silence of grief. It was the peaceful quiet of gratitude, of recognition that something beautiful had been preserved and shared. Do you understand now why I couldn't let Clayton Reed turn that into a sensational soundbite? Strait asked. That recording isn't tea about my career or her potential as a performer. It's about a father and daughter sharing the thing they both loved most in the world. It's about 15 minutes of perfect happiness that nothing, not even death, can take away. Michael nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He thought about Danny, about all the conversations they had that he wished he could hear again, about the stupid arguments that had seemed important at the time, but meant nothing compared to the simple fact of being together. "Mr. Strait," he said finally, "would you be willing to let me include some of these recordings in the book? Not to exploit them, but to show people what love sounds like, what it means to find joy even in the shadow of loss." Strait was quiet for a long time, and Michael could see him wrestling with decades of protective instincts. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Yes, but only if you promise me something. When people hear Jennifer's voice, I want them to understand that she wasn't just George Strait's daughter who died tragically. She was a bright, funny, talented girl who loved horses and hated Brussels sprouts and wanted to write songs that would make people feel less alone. Her death was tragic, but her life was beautiful, and that is what I want people to remember." Over the next 3 days, Michael lived at the Strait Ranch, conducting the most in-depth interviews of his career. But more than that, he found himself healing in ways he hadn't expected. Watching George and Norma together, seeing how they had built a life that honored Jennifer's memory without being imprisoned by it, he began to understand that grief didn't have to be a life sentence. It could be transformed into something else: wisdom, compassion, a deeper appreciation for the precious fragility of every moment with the people we love. On his final morning at the ranch, Michael found himself sitting in the memorial studio, listening to Jennifer's voice and thinking about Danny. For the first time since his brother E.'s death, he was able to remember him without the crushing weight of guilt and regret. Danny's addiction had been a disease, not a choice, and his death had been a tragedy, not a failure on Michael's part to save him. "She would have liked you," Strait said, joining him in the studio. "Jennifer had a gift for seeing the best in people, for understanding their hearts even when they were struggling. You have that same quality, that ability to see past someone's public face to who they really are." When Michael finally left the ranch, he carried with him not just the material for what would become the most important book of his career, but also something more valuable: a new understanding of what it meant to carry loss with grace and dignity. The book, titled The Sanctuary, George Strait and the Healing Power of Memory, was published 8 months later to unprecedented critical and commercial success. But more important than the awards and bestseller lists was the response from readers who found comfort in its pages, people who were dealing with their own losses and discovered that healing was possible without forgetting, that moving forward didn't mean leaving the people they loved behind. Clayton Reed's documentary was quietly shelved after distributors learned about the criminal nature of his source material and the existence of Michael's authorized biography. Reed himself faced legal consequences for trafficking in stolen goods, and his reputation in the industry never recovered from the scandal. But for Michael, the most meaningful outcome was the letter he received from a young mother in Kansas whose teenage son had died in a car accident 6 months earlier. But reading about how Mr. Strait created a sanctuary for his daughter's memory helped me understand that I could do the same for my boy, she wrote. "Grief doesn't have to be a prison. It can be a garden where love continues to grow." 6 months after the book's publication, Michael returned to the Strait Ranch for Jennifer's birthday, a tradition that George and Norma had maintained for 39 years. As they sat in the memorial studio, listening to her voice fill the room with laughter and music, Michael realized that he had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for: a way to honor Danny's memory that brought healing rather than pain. "You know," he said to George as they watched the sun set over the Texas hills, "I think Jennifer and Danny would be friends if they could meet." They both had that quality of seeing the beauty in ordinary moments, of wanting to make other people feel less alone in the world. George smiled, the same peaceful expression Michael had seen on his face that first night in the hotel when he talked about carrying grief like a stone in his pocket rather than a boulder on his chest. "Maybe they can," he said simply. "Maybe that's what happens when we keep their love alive in our hearts and share it with the world." Maybe that's how they continue to touch lives and bring comfort to people who need to know that loss doesn't have to mean the end of hope. As Michael drove away from the ranch that evening, he thought about the incredible journey that had brought him from a failed interview to a life-changing friendship, from exploitation to honor, from despair to hope. He had come to Texas looking for a story about the king of country music, but he had found something infinitely more valuable, a blueprint for transforming grief into grace, loss into love, and memory into a living testimony to the enduring power of the human spirit. The last entry in Michael Yeah's notebook from that trip was simple but profound. Some stories choose their writers, and some writers are chosen by their stories. The greatest privilege of my career wasn't interviewing George Strait the legend, but being trusted with George Strait the father's most sacred memories. In learning to honor Jennifer Ed's legacy, I finally learned how to honor Danny Ed's as well. Grief shared with understanding hearts becomes not a burden, but a bridge, connecting us to others who walk the same difficult path and reminding us that love, once given, can never truly be lost.